Sometimes the most broken souls recognize each other across a crowded field. Sometimes the gentlest touch comes from the roughest hands. In ancient Norway, a wild black horse named Skelmir terrorized a village for 3 winters. No warrior could tame him. Every attempt ended in blood and failure. The village elders finally decided the beast must die. Then Rurik Ironhide stepped forward. This scarred berserker, fresh from years of exile, walked up to the savage stallion without weapons or rope. What happened next shocked everyone watching. In one quiet moment, he transformed a creature of pure rage into a willing companion. The village had never seen anything like it. But what did Rurik whisper to that wild horse that changed everything? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the pine forests of Dragsvik like the breath of sleeping giants. Rurik Ironhide sat on the worn wooden steps of his small dwelling, watching the sun struggle through the dense canopy above. 3 months had passed since his return from exile, yet the village still regarded him with the careful distance reserved for wolves that might yet remember their wildness. His weathered hands traced the split handle of his battle axe, the weapon that had once made him legend among the berserkers of King Harald's army. Now it lay broken beside his doorway, its iron head still sharp, but its oak handle cracked clean through from pommel to blade. Like everything else in his life, it bore the scars of that terrible day when honor became shame, when brotherhood became betrayal. The sound of hoofbeats thundered through the morning quiet, followed by the sharp crack of splintering wood. Skelmir was running again. Rurik rose slowly, his joints protesting the movement. At 43 winters, his body carried the accumulated weight of countless battles, but it was his spirit that felt truly heavy. Through the trees, he could see the massive black stallion charging through the village's outer fields, his mane streaming like a battle banner in the wind. Even from this distance, the horse's power was unmistakable, raw, untamed, magnificent. "The beast grows bolder," came a voice behind him. Rurik turned to see Bjorn Eriksson approaching, the young man's face flushed from running. At 19 winters, Bjorn possessed all the eager courage that Rurik remembered having once, long ago. The boy had taken to visiting Rurik's isolated dwelling, perhaps drawn by the same curiosity that made him watch Skelmir from safe distances. "Bolder, or more desperate," Rurik replied, his voice carrying the roughened texture of a man who had spoken little in recent years. "My father says the horse is cursed," Bjorn continued, settling beside Rurik on the steps. "Says no natural animal could resist rope and bit the way Skelmir does. Elder Astrid agrees, she claims. The stallion carries the spirit of some warrior who died dishonored, doomed to run wild until he finds peace." Rurik studied the young man's face. Bjorn's father, Gunnar Eriksson, was among those who had welcomed Rurik's return with barely concealed suspicion. The blacksmith's hammer rang differently when Rurik passed his forge, as if the very metal sensed the presence of one who had fallen from grace. "What do you think?" Rurik asked. Bjorn was quiet for a long moment, watching Skelmir disappear into the deeper forest. "I think some things resist taming because they remember freedom too clearly." The wisdom in those words surprised Rurik. Perhaps there was more to this boy than eager youth. The village of Dragsvik had grown around the natural harbour where the fjord met the sea, its wooden buildings clustered like weathered bones against the mountainside. 200 souls called this place home, sustained by fishing, farming, and the occasional trader brave enough to venture this far north. It was a good place for a man to disappear, if that man wished to be forgotten. Jarl Magnus Bloodaxe ruled here with the steady hand of a leader who understood that survival depended more on wisdom than warfare. His great hall dominated the village centre, its carved dragon heads watching over his people with painted eyes that seemed to follow movement. Magnus had granted Rurik permission to settle on the village's edge, but that permission had come with unspoken conditions: keep to yourself, cause no trouble, And remember that exile can become banishment at the whim of those who still command respect. Skelmir broke through Olaf's fence again last night, Bjorn said, interrupting Rurik's thoughts. Scattered his sheep from here to the river. Olaf's talking about petitioning the Jarl for a hunting party. This was not the first such petition. For 3 winters, ever since Skelmir had first appeared in these forests, the horse had been both marvel and menace. No one knew where he had come from. One day the woods had been empty, the next they echoed with the thunder of hooves and the wild neighing of a stallion who seemed to answer to no earthly master. The attempts to capture him had become legendary in their failure. Strong Thorstein, who could wrestle a bear to submission, had lasted 3 heartbeats on Skelmir's back before finding himself face down in mud. Young Harold the Swift, fastest runner in the village, had attempted to chase the horse into a pen, only to watch Skelmir leap the fence like a bird taking flight. Even the professional horse catchers who travelled the trading routes had given up after a single encounter, declaring the beast either possessed or mad. Elder Astrid believes differently about the horse, Bjorn continued. She says Skelmir appears in the sacred grove sometimes, near the old temple stones. Claims she's seen him standing motionless among the rune stones, as if he's listening to voices only he can hear. Rurik's interest sharpened. Elder Astrid was the village's keeper of the old ways, the woman who remembered the songs and stories that reached back to the time of the gods. If she had truly seen Skelmir in the sacred grove, that detail carried meaning beyond superstition. Has she told the Jarl this? She has. But Magnus thinks more with his sword hand than his spirit these days. He sees only a dangerous animal that threatens his people's livestock and safety. Bjorn paused, studying Rurik's scarred features. What do you see? Before Rurik could answer, the sound of voices carried across the morning air. A crowd was gathering in the village square, their tones urgent and angry. Both men rose, drawn by the commotion. They found perhaps 50 villagers clustered around Jarl Magnus, who stood upon the raised platform beside his hall. His voice carried the authority of command as he addressed his people, but even from the edge of the crowd, Rurik could see the frustration in the leader's weathered face. The horse has gone too far this time, Magnus declared. Last night, he didn't just scatter livestock. He trampled young Astrid's herb garden, the one that supplies our healing herbs for winter. Without those plants, we'll have no medicine when the sickness comes with the snow. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Rurik noticed the way people unconsciously shifted away from him as he and Bjorn joined the gathering, creating a small circle of space around the exile. I've sent word to Jarl Eriksson in the south, Magnus continued. His master horsemen will arrive within the moon's turning. If they cannot tame the beast, then we will end this threat permanently. Permanently? Called out Astrid the Elder, her voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade through cloth. The ancient woman pushed forward, her staff clicking against the packed earth. Despite her 70 winters, her back remained straight and her eyes burned with inner fire. You would kill a creature that may carry the blessing of the gods. I would protect my people, Magnus replied firmly, as a Jarl must. And if you're wrong, if the horse is sent by Odin himself, and we spill sacred blood out of fear and impatience. The crowd grew quiet. Even those who favored killing the stallion recognized the danger in offending the gods. Elder Astrid's knowledge of the old ways commanded respect, even when that respect was grudging. Then we'll face that judgment when it comes, Magnus said finally, but I won't let one animal, sacred or not, threaten the safety of our children. Rurik found himself stepping forward before conscious thought could stop him. The crowd parted around him like water around a stone, and suddenly he stood alone in the circle of space before the Jarl's platform. There might be another way, he said. Magnus's eyes narrowed. Rurik Ironhide, I wondered when we'd hear from you on this matter. Let me try to approach the horse. The suggestion sent a ripple of shock through the gathered villagers. Someone laughed a harsh, bitter sound. Rurik recognized the voice of Gunnar Eriksson, Bjorn's father. The fallen berserker thinks he can succeed where stronger men have failed, Gunnar called out. What makes you believe you're different from the rest of us, exile? The word hung in the morning air like a blade. Exile, the title that defined him now more than any achievement from his warrior days. Rurik felt the weight of every watching eye, the pressure of old judgment and newer suspicion. I don't know that I can succeed, he admitted, his voice steady despite the racing of his heart. But I know that I understand something about being wild. Elder Astrid studied him with those sharp eyes that seemed to see beyond the surface of things. You would approach Skelmir as the others have? With rope and force? No. Rurik's answer came quietly, but it carried to every corner of the square. I would approach him as one broken thing to another. The honesty in those words created a moment of profound silence. In that silence, Rurik could almost hear the village weighing his proposal, measuring his fallen status against their desperate need for a solution. Finally, Jarl Magnus spoke. You understand the risk. If you fail, if the horse injures or kills you, the responsibility is yours alone. I understand. And if you succeed, what then? Rurik had not thought that far ahead. The possibility of success seemed as distant as the summer stars. Then perhaps we'll both find some peace. Magnus considered this for a long moment. When he finally nodded, it was with the reluctant agreement of a leader who had run out of better options. One chance, the Jarl declared. One attempt. If you fail, the hunting party rides south tomorrow, and we end this matter with steel. As the crowd began to disperse, Elder Astrid approached Rurik. Her ancient face was unreadable, but there was something in her manner that suggested she saw more in this moment than the others realized. Walk with me, she said simply. They moved away from the village square, following a path that wound through the birch groves toward the sacred stones that marked the boundary between the world of men and the realm of the gods. Here, among the moss-covered runestones, Elder Astrid finally stopped. You spoke truly back there, she said, about being broken. But tell me, Rurik Ironhide, do you seek to heal yourself or to find a kindred spirit in your suffering? The question cut deep, reaching places in Rurik's heart that he had tried to wall away. I don't know, he admitted. Maybe both. Skelmir has been seen here, among these stones, Astrid said, placing her weathered hand on the nearest carving. Standing as still as death, head lowered as if in prayer or penance. Whatever spirit drives that animal, it carries the weight of memory. As do we all, yes, but some. Memories are heavier than others. Her eyes searched his face. What memory drives you, exile? What sin weighs so heavy that even 3 winters cannot lighten its burden? Rurik was quiet for a long time, listening to the wind move through the ancient trees. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I betrayed my oath, brothers. In the moment when they needed me most, I chose survival over honor. And now I live with that choice every day. Elder Astrid nodded slowly. Perhaps that is why you alone might reach the horse. Skelmir runs not from men, but from the weight of whatever he carries. He recognizes hunters, warriors, those who approach with conquest in their hearts. She turned to face him fully. But you approach with understanding. That may make all the difference. As they walked back toward the village, Rurik found himself thinking about the black stallion running wild through the forests, carrying his own burden of memory and loss. Tomorrow, he would face that magnificent, untamable creature with nothing but his scars and his understanding of what it meant to be broken. Tonight, he would prepare for the most important encounter of his life, one that might heal them both or destroy them entirely. Dawn came cold and grey, mist rolling off the fjord like the breath of sleeping giants. Rurik stood at the edge of the sacred grove, his weathered hands empty of weapons for the first time in 30 years. Behind him, the entire village of Dragsvik had gathered men, women, and children, clustering at what they hoped was a safe distance from whatever was about to unfold. Skelmir stood among the ancient runestones like a shadow given form. The black stallion's coat gleamed with morning dew, his massive frame motionless except for the occasional flick of an ear or twitch of his tail. His head was lowered toward the largest of the carved stones, as if he were reading the runes that told stories of gods and heroes from ages past. "He's been there since before sunrise," whispered Bjorn, who had positioned himself closest to Rurik among the watchers. "Just standing, like he's waiting." Rurik nodded slowly, studying the magnificent animal. Up close, Skelmir was even more impressive than the stories suggested. He stood nearly 18 hands high, his musculature speaking of power that could crush a man without effort. Scars crisscrossed, his hide some from branches and brambles, others that looked suspiciously like the marks left by ropes and weapons. This was not just a wild horse. This was a creature that had survived countless attempts at conquest. "The runes he's near," Elder Astrid said quietly, joining them at the grove's edge. "They tell the story of Sleipnir, Odin's 8-legged horse, the one who could travel between the worlds of the living and the dead." "You think," Bjorn began. "I think some stories echo across time," Astrid interrupted. "And sometimes the echoes take physical form." "Jarl." Magnus approached from behind, his hand resting on his sword hilt. The gesture was unconscious, a warrior's habit when facing the unknown. "The sun climbs higher, Rurik. If you mean to try this thing, now would be the time." Rurik took a deep breath, tasting pine and earth, and something else, something wild that made his pulse quicken. "If I don't return, you'll return," Elder Astrid said firmly. "Both of you will." The certainty in her voice surprised him. But there was no more time for doubt or preparation. Skelmir had raised his head and was looking directly at Rurik, as if the stallion had been waiting for this moment as long as the exile had been dreading it. Rurik stepped into the grove. The first thing that struck him was the absolute silence that fell over the watching crowd. Even the wind seemed to still as his boots pressed into the sacred earth. Skelmir's ears flicked forward, alert but not yet alarmed. Dark eyes, intelligent beyond anything Rurik had expected, he watched his every movement. "Easy?" Rurik murmured, though whether to the horse or himself, he couldn't say. Easy now. He had seen men approach horses before, had done it himself in his younger years. The proper way involved confidence, firm movements, the establishment of dominance through will and presence. Every instinct he possessed as a warrior told him to project strength, to claim the space around him as his own. Instead, Rurik stopped 20 paces away and slowly lowered himself to his knees. A gasp went up from the watching villagers. Warriors did not kneel before beasts. Men did not show submission to animals. But Rurik was no longer concerned with what warriors did. He had forfeited that title long ago on a battlefield where honor meant less than survival. Skelmir's reaction was immediate and startling. The great stallion lifted his head higher, nostrils flaring as he tested the air. His ears swiveled forward completely, focused entirely on this strange human who knelt in the dust like a supplicant before a god. "I know what it is to run," Rurik said, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying clearly in the still air. "I know what it is to be hunted, to have men with ropes and chains chase you until your heart pounds so hard you think it might burst." Skelmir took a single step closer. From behind him, Rurik heard Bjorn's sharp intake of breath, but he kept his attention fixed on the magnificent animal before him. The stallion's head was cocked now, as if he were truly listening to the words, trying to understand their meaning. "I know what it is to be called wild," Rurik continued, settling back on his heels. "To be named dangerous by men who fear what they cannot control. I know the weight of carrying something so heavy that it drives you to run from everything that might offer comfort." Another step. Skelmir was now close enough that Rurik could see the individual hairs in his mane, could smell the wild scent of pine forests and mountain streams that clung to his coat. But I also know what it is to be tired, Rurik said, and this time his voice cracked slightly. Bone deep, tired of running from the thing that chases you most, the memory of what you've done. Skelmir stopped directly in front of him, so close that the horse's warm breath misted the cold air between them. The stallion's head lowered until his dark eyes were level with Rurik's scarred face. For a heartbeat that stretched into eternity, man and horse simply looked at each other. In Skelmir's gaze, Rurik saw intelligence, pain, and something else, recognition, as if the animal truly did understand the weight that some souls carry, the burden of choices that cannot be undone. Slowly, carefully, Rurik reached into the small pouch at his belt and withdrew something he had not planned to bring, a piece of bread from his morning meal, saved out of habit rather than intention. He held it out in his open palm. Skelmir's ears flicked uncertainly. His nostrils investigated the offering, then pulled back. "It's not much," Rurik admitted, "but it's freely given, no tricks, no traps. Just one exile to another." The stallion studied him for another long moment, then delicately lifted the bread from Rurik's palm. As he chewed, his head remained lowered, close enough that Rurik could see the old pain that lived behind those intelligent eyes. "What did they do to you?" Rurik asked softly. "What drove you to these forests, beautiful one?" As if in answer, Skelmir turned slightly, revealing the full extent of the scars that marked his hide. Some were clearly from thorns and branches, the inevitable marks of a creature that had spent years running wild, but others told a darker story. Rope burns around his neck and legs, the parallel scratches that could only come from spurs. A long, pale line across his flank that looked disturbingly like a whip mark. "They tried to break you," Rurik breathed. "They tried to make you into something you weren't meant to be." Skelmir's response was to lower his great head even further, until his forehead nearly touched Rurik's chest. The gesture was so unexpected, so trusting, that for a moment Rurik could barely breathe. Behind him he heard Elder Astrid's voice, barely audible. "The gods preserve us." "He's submitting." But Rurik knew better. This wasn't submission, it was something far rarer and more precious. This was mutual recognition between two souls who had been broken by the world and had somehow found each other in their pain. Carefully, as if handling something made of spun glass, Rurik raised his hand and placed it on Skelmir's neck. The stallion's coat was warm beneath his palm, the powerful muscles beneath twitching slightly at the contact, but not pulling away. "We don't have to run anymore," Rurik whispered. "Either of us. We can choose something different." For one perfect moment, peace settled over the sacred grove like a benediction. Man and horse stood together in the silence, two outcasts who had found in each other the understanding that the world had withheld. Then Skelmir raised his head and stepped back, not in rejection, but in completion of some ritual that only he understood. He looked at Rurik once more, and in that gaze was something that might have been gratitude, or hope, or simply acknowledgement that they now shared a bond that could not be broken by force or fear. The stallion turned and walked calmly to the edge of the grove, where he paused to look back. Then, without haste or urgency, he disappeared into the forest as silently as he had come. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the whispered prayers of those who had witnessed something beyond their understanding. Rurik remained kneeling in the sacred earth, his hand still extended as if he could feel the warmth of Skelmir's neck beneath his palm. What had just happened defied everything he thought he knew about horses, about wildness, about the distance between man and beast. "Rurik!" Jarl Magnus's voice came from directly behind him, rough with emotion. "What did you do?" Rurik slowly rose to his feet, brushing the earth from his knees. When he turned to face the crowd, he saw awe and fear in equal measure on their faces. "I listened," he said simply. And for the first time in 3 years, something listened back. The news of what had happened in the sacred grove spread through Dragsvik like wildfire through dry grass. By evening, the tale had already begun to change. In the telling, some claimed Rurik had used ancient magic. Others whispered that he had made a pact with the spirits of the forest. The truth, that he had simply knelt and spoken with honesty, seemed too simple for such a momentous event. Rurik sat alone in his small dwelling as darkness fell, turning over in his weathered hands the object that had become his most precious possession. It was a simple thing, a leather cord braided from strips of deerskin, worn smooth by countless fingers. He had found it that morning in the sacred grove, lying among the rune stones where Skelmir had stood. The leather braider was old, its surface darkened by time and handling. Someone had worked it with great care, each twist of the cord precise and deliberate. Carved into one end was a small symbol, a horse's head surrounded by runes that spoke of freedom and the bond between rider and mount. This was no wild horse's ornament. This had belonged to someone who had loved Skelmir deeply. A soft knock at his door interrupted his contemplation. "Enter," he called, expecting to see Bjorn with his endless questions about the morning's events. Instead, Elder Astrid stepped across his threshold, her ancient eyes bright with purpose. She carried with her a wooden box that looked older than the village itself. "May I sit?" she asked, settling herself on the rough bench beside his hearth without waiting for an answer. "We have much to discuss." Rurik set down the leather braider carefully. "If you've come to explain what happened in the grove, I've come to tell you what must happen next," Astrid interrupted. "The connection you forged with Skelmir today, it's only the beginning. That horse didn't appear in our forests by chance, and he didn't submit to you without reason." She opened the wooden box with reverent care, revealing contents that made Rurik's breath catch. Inside lay another leather braider, nearly identical to the one he had found, but this one bore different markings. Alongside it rested a silver amulet shaped like Odin's ravens, and beneath that, wrapped in faded silk, what appeared to be a piece of parchment covered in runic writing. "These belonged to my grandmother's sister," Astrid said, lifting the braider from its resting place. "Sigrid Horse Whisperer," they called her. She had a gift with animals that some said bordered on the supernatural. Rurik studied the ancient woman's face. "What does this have to do with Skelmir?" Sigrid disappeared 40 years ago, along with her prize stallion. She had raised the horse from a colt, a magnificent black creature she called Skolfax, after the wolf that chases the sun. Astrid's voice dropped to a whisper. Some said she had trained him too well, that the bond between them had grown beyond what was natural. Others claimed she had taught him secrets that horses were not meant to know. Understanding began to dawn in Rurik's mind, cold and impossible. "You think Skelmir is... I think Skelmir carries the bloodline, if not the very spirit, of Skolfax." Astrid unwrapped the parchment with trembling fingers. Sigrid left this behind, hidden in the sacred grove. Instructions for those who might one day need to heal what she had broken. The runic text was complex, written in an archaic style that challenged even Rurik's knowledge of the old writing. But as he studied the symbols, patterns began to emerge, descriptions of training methods unlike anything he had ever seen, techniques that spoke not of dominance but of partnership. "She trained horses differently," Rurik murmured, tracing one of the symbols with his finger. "She trained them as equals," Astrid confirmed. "The runes speak of shared burdens, of healing that flows both ways between rider and mount. But they also speak of a price, a bond so deep that breaking it could destroy both parties." A chill ran down Rurik's spine as he read further. The text described warning signs, symptoms of a connection that had grown too strong. Horses that pined to death when separated from their riders. Men who lost themselves so completely in the partnership that they forgot their human nature. What happened to Sigrid? No one knows for certain. She rode out one morning and never returned. Some search parties found her horse's hoofprints leading to the edge of a cliff overlooking the sea, but no bodies were ever recovered. Astrid's eyes met his. Others say she and Skolfax chose to run rather than face what they had become. The implications settled over Rurik like a cold fog. The connection he had felt with Skelmir that morning, the sense of mutual understanding, of shared pain, had felt like healing. Now it seemed it might be something far more dangerous. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. "Because you have a choice to make," Astrid replied, gathering up the ancient artifacts. "You can walk away from this. Let the Jarl's hunting party deal with Skelmir as they see fit. Or you can follow Sigrid's path, learn her methods, and try to heal what she left broken. And risk losing myself in the process? Every healing carries risk," Astrid said simply. "But consider the alternative. Skelmir has been running wild for 3 winters, growing more desperate with each passing season. How long before that desperation turns to true madness? How long before the beautiful creature you met today becomes the monster the village fears?" Through his small window, Rurik could see torches moving through the village. Even now, preparations were being made for the hunting party. Tomorrow, if he did not act, skilled horsemen would arrive from the south with ropes and nets and the determination to end this matter permanently. "The leather braider I found," he said, holding up the worn cord. "It belonged to Sigrid?" "I believe so. Skelmir has been carrying it all this time, a reminder of the one person who truly understood him." Astrid rose to leave, but paused at the door. "There's something else you should know. The morning after Sigrid disappeared, every horse in the village was found standing at the edge of the sacred grove, facing the forest where she had vanished. They stood there for 3 days without eating or drinking, as if they were mourning. After she left, Rurik sat in the growing darkness, weighing the choice before him. Outside his window, the sounds of the village slowly faded as people settled in for the night. But somewhere in the forest, a black stallion was running through the moonlight, carrying 40 years of grief and the memory of a bond that had ended in mystery and loss. Rurik picked up his broken battle-axe, feeling its familiar weight. Once, this weapon had defined him, had made him legend among the warriors of his generation. But that legend had ended in betrayal and exile, leaving him with nothing but scars and regret. Perhaps it was time to forge a new legend, not with steel and violence, but with understanding and the ancient wisdom of a woman who had loved horses enough to disappear with one rather than see their bond destroyed. He set the axe aside and reached for the braided leather cord, turning it over in his hands as he made his decision. Tomorrow, he would begin learning Sigrid's methods. Tomorrow he would take the first steps down a path that might lead to healing or to a madness that could consume them both. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, Rurik Ironhide felt something stirring in his chest that might have been hope. Dawn found Rurik standing at the edge of the forest, Sigrid's ancient parchment tucked safely in his leather pouch alongside the braided cord. The runic instructions had kept him awake most of the night, their archaic symbols slowly revealing secrets that challenged everything he thought he knew about the relationship between man and beast. The first lesson was the hardest to accept. Seek not to tame, but to be tamed. The horse must choose the human as much as the human chooses the horse. According to Sigrid's writings, traditional horse training was built on a foundation of dominance, breaking the animal's will until it submitted to human authority. But her methods spoke of something entirely different. A partnership where both parties surrendered part of themselves to create something greater than either could achieve alone. "You're early," came Bjorn's voice from behind him. The young man approached with careful steps, his face showing the mixture of excitement and fear that had become common among the villagers since yesterday's events. "My father says you've lost your mind, attempting to follow the path of the witch woman." "Your father may be right," Rurik admitted. "But madness sometimes looks like wisdom when viewed from the proper distance." They walked together into the forest, following the network of game trails that crisscrossed the wilderness around Dragsvik. According to the ancient text, the second meeting with Skelmir should not take place in the sacred grove that had been neutral ground, a place for first contact. The next encounter needed to happen in the horse's territory, where he felt secure enough to begin trusting. The runes spoke of bringing offerings, Rurik said, checking the contents of his pouch. Not food, but things that carry meaning, objects that tell a story. Bjorn glanced at the items Rurik had selected. Your warrior's ring? The one that marks your service to King Harald? Rurik touched the silver band that had adorned his finger for 20 years. Sigrid wrote that horses can sense the weight of our past, the stories that our possessions carry. This ring represents honor earned and honor lost. It tells the truth of who I am. The second offering was more unusual, a child's wooden horse, carved with loving care and worn smooth by small hands. Rurik had found it abandoned in the village years ago, a toy whose owner had outgrown its simple pleasures. Something about its honest craftsmanship had compelled him to save it. And that? Innocence, Rurik said simply. The memory of what horses mean to us before the world teaches us to see them as tools to be used. They found Skelmir in a clearing where wildflowers grew among the ancient pines, their bright petals creating patches of color in the green dimness. The stallion stood perfectly still, his head raised as if he had been waiting for them. When he saw Rurik, his ears pricked forward with what might have been recognition. Rurik stopped at the clearing's edge, remembering Sigrid's third instruction. Never approach uninvited. Let the horse control the distance until trust is earned. I've come to learn, he said quietly, settling himself on a fallen log. If you're willing to teach. Skelmir studied him with those intelligent dark eyes, then took a single step forward. When Rurik remained motionless, the horse took another step, then another, until he stood close enough that his breath warmed the morning air between them. Carefully, Rurik withdrew the silver ring from his finger and held it out in his open palm. Skelmir investigated the offering with delicate nostrils, his head cocked as if he truly was reading the story the metal contained. 20 years I wore this, Rurik said. 20 years of battles fought, oaths sworn, brothers trusted. His voice roughened. And one terrible day, when I chose my life over theirs. To his amazement, Skelmir lowered his head and gently touched the ring with his muzzle, not taking it, but acknowledging it. Then the horse stepped back and waited. Understanding flooded through Rurik. This was not about giving gifts, it was about sharing truths. The horse wanted to know who he was, what pain he carried, what hope he still possessed. He set the ring on the ground between them and withdrew the wooden horse. This time, when he held it out, Skelmir's response was immediate and startling. The great stallion whickered softly, a sound of recognition that made the hair on Rurik's arm stand upright. You remember toys, Rurik breathed. You remember being young, being loved by someone who saw you as more than a beast to be broken. Skelmir stepped closer, his head lowering until his forehead nearly touched Rurik's chest in an echo of yesterday's moment of connection. But this time, instead of stepping away, the horse remained close. Slowly, carefully, Rurik raised his hand and placed it on Skelmir's neck. The stallion's coat was warm beneath his palm, the powerful muscles beneath twitching but not pulling away. For several heartbeats, they remained connected, man and horse sharing a silence that spoke of trust beginning to form. Then Skelmir surprised him completely by stepping to one side and lowering himself to the ground, folding his legs beneath him in a gesture that left Rurik speechless. The proud stallion, who had never submitted to rope or bridle, was offering himself in a display of vulnerability that defied everything Rurik thought he knew about horses. What does it mean? Bjorn whispered from the forest's edge, his voice barely audible. Rurik consulted his memory of the runic text. According to Sigrid's writings, this was the most sacred moment in the bonding process, when the horse chose to make himself defenseless in the presence of a human. It was a gesture that could only be answered with equal vulnerability. Without hesitation, Rurik knelt beside the reclining stallion and placed both hands on the great horse's neck. I understand, he whispered. We're both choosing to trust. For the next hour they remained together in the flowering clearing, man kneeling beside horse in a communion that transcended species. Rurik found himself sharing stories he had never told, another living soul. The weight of guilt he carried, the loneliness of exile, the desperate hope that perhaps redemption was still possible. Skelmir listened with the patience of a confessor, occasionally lifting his head to nuzzle Rurik's shoulder or breathe warm air against his face. It was as if the horse understood not just the words, but the emotions beneath them. When the sun reached its zenith, Skelmir finally rose to his feet, shaking the forest debris from his coat. He looked at Rurik once more, then walked calmly to the clearing's edge. But instead of disappearing into the forest, as he had before, he paused and looked back, an invitation as clear as spoken words. "He wants me to follow," Rurik said, rising slowly. "Is that wise?" Bjorn asked. Rurik considered the question, then smiled for the first time in months. "Probably not. But wisdom isn't what either of us needs right now." Together, they followed the black stallion deeper into the forest, leaving behind the safety of the known world and stepping into a realm where ancient bonds could still be forged between the most unlikely of companions. 3 days had passed since Skelmir had first led them deeper into the forest, and Rurik found himself living between two worlds, the village where he was still viewed with suspicion and wonder, and the wild places where a black stallion was teaching him lessons that had no names. The artifact that had emerged from their deepening bond was unexpected, a small collection of smooth river stones that Skelmir had led him to beside a hidden stream. The horse had watched intently as Rurik gathered them, then had touched each one with his muzzle as if blessing them. Now they rested in a leather pouch at Rurik's belt, their weight a constant reminder of the trust growing between them. Each stone was perfectly round, polished by countless years of flowing water. According to Sigrid's writings, such stones were sacred to the old religion, symbols of endurance, of patience, of the slow transformation that came from accepting rather than resisting the forces that shaped one's life. "The hunting party from the south arrives tomorrow," Bjorn said as they made their way through the morning forest. "My father says Jarl Eriksson himself rides with them." Rurik nodded grimly. News of the approaching horsemen had reached Dragsvik 2 days ago, carried by a messenger who spoke of the finest horse catchers in all of Norway riding north to deal with the demon stallion that had terrorized the forest folk. "Skelmir knows," Rurik replied. "Yesterday, when we met at the pass stream, he was different, more alert, more restless. Animals sense these things before we do. They found the stallion in a new place today, a high meadow overlooking the village where wild flowers nodded in the mountain breeze. From here, the approaching riders would be visible long before they reached Dragsvik's walls. Skelmir stood at the meadow's edge like a sentinel, his magnificent head raised and ears pricked toward the southern road. When he saw Rurik approaching, he whickered softly, a greeting that had become as familiar as breathing over the past few days. "You know they're coming for you," Rurik said, settling himself on the grass beside the horse's feet. "The question is, what we do about it." Over the past 3 days, their communication had evolved beyond anything Rurik had thought possible. Not words exactly, but something deeper, an understanding that flowed between them like water finding its level. He would think a thought, and Skelmir would respond with gesture or movement that showed the horse had grasped not just the meaning but the emotion behind it. Now, as if responding to his unspoken question, Skelmir walked to the center of the meadow and began to move in a pattern that made Rurik's breath catch. The stallion was dancing, not the random play of a young horse, but the formal, measured steps of a war mount trained for battle. "Where did you learn that?" Rurik whispered, rising to his feet. The answer came not in words, but in images that seemed to flow directly into his mind. He saw a younger Skelmir, coat gleaming with health and pride, carrying a rider across a vast battlefield. The rider wore armor that marked him as nobility, his banner flying the colors of a house Rurik didn't recognize. But there was darkness in the vision too. He saw the same horse and rider trapped in a burning stable, saw the man's desperate attempts to free his mount as flames licked at the wooden walls. He saw the moment when the rider made the choice that would haunt them both, cutting Skelmir's lead rope and driving him toward the only escape, a gap in the wall that was wide enough for a horse but not for a man in armor. Skelmir had escaped. His rider had not. "You carry his memory," Rurik said, understanding flooding through him. "That's why you run. That's why you can't let anyone close. You blame yourself for surviving when he couldn't." The horse stopped his war dance and lowered his head, the weight of old grief visible in every line of his powerful frame. In that moment, Rurik saw not a wild beast, but a soul in torment, a being who had loved and lost and never forgiven himself for living when his heart-bonded partner had died. "We're more alike than I thought," Rurik said softly. He withdrew one of the river stones from his pouch, its surface warm from contact with his body. "I left my oath brothers to die too. Different circumstances, but the same weight to carry." He held out the stone, and Skelmir approached, to investigate it. As the horse's breath warmed the smooth surface, Rurik found himself speaking the truth he had never shared with another living soul. "We were surrounded by Danish raiders, outnumbered 3-1. My brothers wanted to fight to the death, said it was better to die with honor than live with shame." His voice cracked. "I ran. When the battle turned against us, I ran and left them to face their fate alone." Skelmir lifted his head and looked directly into Rurik's eyes. In that gaze was not judgment, but understanding, the recognition of one haunted soul by another. "The hunting party won't understand what you are," Rurik continued. "They'll see only a dangerous animal to be subdued. They'll use pain and fear to break your spirit, and if that fails, they'll—" He couldn't finish the sentence. The thought of Skelmir being destroyed by men who saw him as nothing more than a problem to be solved was unbearable. The horse seemed to sense his distress. Skelmir approached and rested his great head against Rurik's chest, offering comfort in the simple contact. For several minutes they stood together in the meadow, two beings who had found in each other the understanding that the world had withheld. When Skelmir finally stepped back, it was to begin moving again, but this time not in the formal patterns of war. This dance was different, fluid and graceful, speaking of partnership rather than conflict. The stallion moved in circles around Rurik, his steps perfectly placed, his timing flawless. "You're asking me to ride you," Rurik said, wonder and fear warring in his voice. "After all this time, all the trust we've built, you're offering to carry me." Skelmir stopped directly in front of him and slowly, deliberately lowered himself to the ground. The gesture was unmistakable, an invitation to mount, given freely and without coercion. Rurik's hands trembled as he approached. According to Sigrid's writings, this was the moment of greatest danger in the bonding process. If he climbed onto Skelmir's back and the horse rejected him, the trust they had built could shatter beyond repair. But if he refused the offering, he would be telling Skelmir that their bond was still incomplete, that some part of him still saw the horse as a wild thing to be feared rather than a partner to be trusted. "Together, then," he whispered, placing his hand on Skelmir's shoulder. "Whatever comes, we face it together." As he swung his leg over the stallion's back, Rurik felt the river stone in his pouch press against his hip, a reminder that some transformations could only happen when one learned to flow with the current rather than fighting against it. The moment Rurik settled onto Skelmir's back, the world transformed. What he had expected to be a simple ride became something beyond his understanding, a merging of consciousness that left him breathless and reeling. Through the horse's senses, he could feel the earth's vibrations beneath. Hooves that had never known shoes, could smell the approach of rain hours before clouds appeared, could sense the heartbeat of every living thing in the forest around them. Skelmir rose to his feet with fluid grace, and suddenly they were moving not the controlled gait of a trained mount, but something wild and free that spoke of wind across open water and storms racing through mountain passes. Rurik found himself laughing for the first time in years, the joy bubbling up from a place deep within that he had thought permanently sealed. They rode through the forest like partners in an ancient dance, horse and rider moving as one entity. Skelmir seemed to anticipate Rurik's thoughts before he formed them, turning and stopping and changing pace in response to desires that existed only in the space between heartbeats. "This is what Sigrid meant," Rurik whispered, leaning forward to rest his hand on Skelmir's powerful neck. "This is what she found, the bond that makes us more than the dues, sum of our parts." But even as the exhilaration filled him, a darker awareness crept in at the edges of his consciousness. In his saddlebags lay a new artifact, one that spoke of the dangers they faced. A carved bone whistle, yellowed with age and marked with runes of warning. He had found it that morning in his dwelling, placed there by Elder Astrid with a note explaining its significance. The whistle had belonged to Sigrid's teacher, a man known as Hakon the Horse Speaker. According to the legends, Hakon had achieved the perfect bond with his mount, so perfect that he eventually lost the ability to distinguish between his own thoughts and those of his horse. When searchers finally found him, he was standing naked in a pasture, attempting to eat grass and whinnying when spoken to. The whistle was carved with protective runes, meant to preserve the human mind during deep bonding, but its presence in Astrid's possession suggested that even magical safeguards sometimes failed. As they rode deeper into the wilderness, Rurik began to understand why. The connection with Skelmir was intoxicating, offering escape from the weight of human guilt and responsibility. Through the horse's consciousness, the world became simple again, reduced to the immediate concerns of safety, sustenance, and the joy of movement through open spaces. But there were memories too, flowing from Skelmir's mind into his own. He experienced the terror of that burning stable as if he had been there, felt the agony of choosing survival over loyalty, carried the weight of survivor's guilt that had driven the horse to 3 years of wild running. "We share more than understanding," Rurik said aloud, his voice strange to his own ears. "We share pain." The observation triggered a flood of shared sensation that nearly overwhelmed him. For a terrifying moment, he couldn't tell where his consciousness ended and Skelmir's began. Was he a man riding a horse, or a horse carrying the weight of human sorrow? Skelmir seemed to sense his distress. The stallion slowed to a walk, then stopped entirely in a clearing beside a crystal stream. As Rurik dismounted, his legs shaking with more than fatigue, he could feel the horse's concern flowing through their connection like warm honey. "Too much, too fast," he muttered, reaching for the bone whistle with trembling fingers. The ancient runes seemed to pulse with their own light as he raised it to his lips, and when he blew a single, soft note, the overwhelming flood of sensation receded to manageable levels. Skelmir whickered softly, his head lowering to drink from the stream. The simple, ordinary act helped ground Rurik in his own humanity, reminded him that no matter how deep their bond became, they remained separate beings with distinct natures. "The hunting party will be here tomorrow," he said, as much to himself as to the horse. "Jarl Eriksson brings his finest men, warriors who have spent their lives learning to dominate animals through force and fear." The thought of those hard men approaching Skelmir with ropes and whips sent a surge of protective rage through the connection. For a moment, Rurik found himself pawing the ground with one foot before he realized what he was doing and forced himself to stop. This was the danger Sigrid had faced, the trap that had claimed her teacher. The bond offered escape from human pain, but it also threatened to strip away human identity entirely. How many others had walked this path, only to lose themselves in the consciousness of their mounts? Yet, even knowing the risk, Rurik couldn't bring himself to regret what they had found together. For the first time since his exile began, he felt complete, not the broken half-man who had fled his responsibilities, but something whole and powerful and worthy of respect. "We need to be smart about tomorrow," he said, settling himself beside the stream. "They'll expect you to run, to resist, to fight their attempts to capture you. What they won't expect is cooperation." Skelmir raised his head from the water, ears pricked with interest. Through their connection, Rurik could feel the horse's intelligence working, considering possibilities and alternatives. If we can demonstrate that you're not wild, that you can be ridden, guided, controlled when you choose to be, they might accept that there's no need to break you. He paused, considering the complexities of Viking politics and pride. Of course, they'll want to know how I managed what their best men could not. The answer to that lay in the bone whistle, in Sigrid's ancient texts, in the dangerous path they had chosen to walk. But revealing the truth would invite questions about old magic and forbidden knowledge that could endanger not just himself, but the entire village. We'll tell them it was patience, he decided. Time and understanding and the willingness to approach you as an equal rather than a beast to be conquered. Skelmir moved. Closer, resting his great head against Rurik's shoulder in a gesture that had become their ritual of agreement. Through the contact, Rurik felt the horse's trust not just in his judgment, but in the strength of the bond they shared. As the afternoon wore on toward evening, they practiced together, refining the subtle communications that would allow them to appear as master and mount while maintaining the deeper partnership that had saved them both. The bone whistle remained within easy reach, a reminder that some gifts came with prices that had to be carefully managed. When darkness finally claimed the forest, Rurik made camp beside the stream while Skelmir grazed nearby. Tomorrow would bring the greatest test their bond had yet faced, not from enemies, but from allies who might not understand the difference between submission and partnership. "Sleep well, my friend," Rurik said quietly, settling beside the small fire he had built. "Tomorrow we discover whether the world is sentient, ready for what we've become." The hunting party arrived at dawn with a thunder of hooves and a display of weaponry that spoke of men accustomed to settling problems with force. Jarl Eriksson himself led them, a massive warrior whose reputation for horse mastery was matched only by his skill with the blade. Behind him rode 12 of the finest horsemen in Norway, their mounts perfectly trained, their equipment gleaming with professional pride. Rurik watched them approach from the edge of the village square, Skelmir standing calmly beside him without rope or bridle. The sight of the untamed stallion so close to the exile drew immediate attention, but what captured every eye was the way the horse positioned himself not as a captive, but as a willing partner. "By Thor's beard," Jarl Eriksson said, dismounting with fluid grace. "The stories were true then. The exile has tamed the demon horse." "Tamed is the wrong word," Rurik replied carefully. "We have reached an understanding." Eriksson approached with the confidence of a man who had never met a horse he couldn't master. His eyes assessed Skelmir with professional interest, noting the stallion's magnificent conformation, the intelligence in his dark gaze, the complete absence of fear or aggression. "Show me," Eriksson commanded. "Mount the beast and demonstrate this understanding." Rurik felt a flicker of warning through his connection with Skelmir. The horse sensed something in the Jarl's manner, a predatory quality that spoke of plans beyond simple demonstration. But they had agreed to this course of action, knowing that cooperation was their only hope of avoiding bloodshed. "As you wish," Rurik said, swinging onto Skelmir's back without saddle or bridle. The effect was immediate and profound. Horse and rider moved as one entity, responding to commands that existed only in thought and intention. They demonstrated collection and extension, lateral movements that would challenge even the finest trained. War horses, and transitions so smooth they seemed to flow like water. The watching horsemen murmured in appreciation and disbelief. Several made the sign against evil, recognizing something beyond ordinary horsemanship in what they witnessed. "Incredible," Eriksson breathed. "In 30 years of training horses, I've never seen anything like this." His expression hardened with sudden determination. "I must have him." The words sent ice through Rurik's veins. "The horse belongs to no one. He chooses to work with me because we understand each other." "Everything belongs to someone," Eriksson replied coldly. "And I represent King Harald himself in this matter. The king has need of such a mount for his campaign against the Danes." From his belt, the Jarl produced an artifact that made Rurik's blood freeze, a royal seal carved from walrus ivory, marked with the raven banner of King Harold Fairhair. The sight of it transported Rurik back to another time, another life, when that same symbol had represented honor and brotherhood and the promise of glory in battle. "You know what this means?" Eriksson continued. "You served under this banner yourself before your disgrace. You know the penalty for refusing a direct command from your king." Rurik's hands trembled on Skelmir's neck. The royal seal meant this was no simple request. It was a royal conscription, backed by the full authority of the crown. To refuse would mean death for him, and probably for anyone who aided him. But there was something else in Eriksson's manner, something that didn't align with the formal authority he claimed. The Jarl's eyes held a hunger that spoke of personal ambition rather than royal duty, and his followers exchanged glances that suggested not all of them were comfortable with this development. "Jarl Magnus," Eriksson called to the local ruler. "You will provide quarters for my men while I arrange transport for the horse. And you," he pointed at Rurik, "will come with us too. Ensure the animals' cooperation during the journey south." "That wasn't part of our agreement," Magnus protested. "Rurik has fulfilled his obligation by demonstrating that the horse can be controlled." "There's no need to. The agreement has changed," Eriksson said flatly. "The horse and his handler are both required for the king's service." Through his connection with Skelmir, Rurik felt the stallion's growing agitation. The horse sensed the trap closing around them, recognized the threat in ways that transcended mere animal instinct. Memories flowed between them, images of other horses stolen from their bonds, forced into service by men who saw them as tools rather than partners. But there was something else in those shared memories, something that made Rurik's breath catch. Among Skelmir's recollections of his former life, he glimpsed a familiar face, a young warrior with earnest eyes and a devotion to justice that had earned him the respect of his peers. The face belonged to Torvin Oathkeeper, one of Rurik's fallen brother warriors. The man Skelmir had loved and lost in that burning stable had been one of the very comrades Rurik had abandoned to save his own life. The realization hit like a physical blow. Skelmir hadn't just recognized a kindred spirit in Rurik, he had recognized the man who had failed to save his beloved rider. The bond they shared was built not just on mutual understanding, but on a shared connection to the same terrible betrayal. "You knew," Rurik whispered, his voice barely audible. "You knew who I was from the beginning." Skelmir turned his head to look at him, and in those dark eyes, Rurik saw not accusation but forgiveness, the absolution he had sought for 3 years and never thought to find. The moment of revelation was shattered by Eriksson's impatient voice. "Enough sentiment. We ride within the hour. Gather whatever belongings you need for the journey." But Rurik was no longer listening to the Jarl's commands. The royal seal, Skelmir's memories, and the growing wrongness he sensed in this situation had crystallized into a terrible understanding. King Harold was indeed campaigning against the Danes, but he was hundreds of miles away, deep in enemy territory. No messenger could have reached him and returned with royal orders in the time since news of Skelmir's taming had spread. The seal was real, but the authority behind it was false. Eriksson was acting on his own initiative, using the king's name to claim a prize that had captured his ambition. "The seal," Rurik said loudly, his voice carrying across the square. "Show it to Elder Astrid. Let her examine the runes that mark its authenticity." Eriksson's face darkened. "You dare question my authority?" "I question nothing," Rurik replied, dismounting slowly. "I simply ask that our village elder confirm what we all wish to believe, that we truly serve our rightful king in this matter." Astrid stepped forward, her ancient eyes bright with deep understanding. As the keeper of the old knowledge, she alone in the village could read the complex runic script that marked royal documents. "I would be honored to verify such an important command," she said formally. For a moment, Eriksson hesitated. In that hesitation, everyone present saw the truth. The Jarl's authority was a lie, his claim false, his intentions purely selfish. Enough of this. Eriksson snarled, his hand moving to his sword. I'll take what I came for, with or without your cooperation. The square erupted into chaos as the false Jarl's men reached for their weapons, only to find themselves facing not just Rurik, but the entire population of Dragsvik. Magnus and his warriors had positioned themselves strategically throughout the crowd, and now they revealed themselves with steel singing from sheaths. But in the center of the storm, Rurik and Skelmir stood calmly together, connected by bonds that transcended the violence erupting around them. They had found each other across the gulf of species and time, had shared forgiveness for failures that had haunted them both, and had discovered in their partnership something worth defending against any threat. Choose. Eriksson. Rurik called out over the clash of weapons. Face the justice of honest men, or flee with what honor you have left. The false Jarl looked around at the determined faces surrounding him, weighed his chances against an entire village aroused to righteous anger, and made the only choice that offered survival. This isn't over, he snarled, backing toward his horse. The king will hear of this defiance. Then he'll also hear the truth, Magnus replied grimly, and the penalty for using his name falsely. As Eriksson and his men fled south in disgrace, Rurik felt a profound shift in his relationship with both the village and with Skelmir. They were no longer outcasts seeking acceptance, but protectors who had proven their worth when it mattered most. The royal seal lay forgotten in the dust, its false authority powerless against the bonds of trust that had saved them all. 3 days after Eriksson's flight, a messenger arrived, bearing news that turned Rurik's blood to ice. The boy collapsed in the village square, his horse lathered with sweat and his eyes wide with terror. In his trembling hands he carried an artifact that spoke of devastation beyond imagination, a charred piece of wood marked with the raven seal of King Harald. But this time the authority was genuine. Danish raiders, the messenger gasped. Accepting the cup of water, Elder Astrid pressed into his hands. 200 longships landed at Stavanger 3 days ago. They're burning everything in their path, moving north along the coast. Jarl Magnus stepped forward, his face grave. How far south are they now? 50 miles, maybe less. They've sacked every village between Stavanger and here. The boy's voice cracked. There are no survivors, my lord. They're not taking slaves or demanding tribute. They're killing everyone. The charred wood fragment told the story without words. It bore the carved raven that had once marked a royal hall, now reduced to ash and memory. This wasn't a raid for wealth or slaves. This was something far worse. This was extermination. King Harald, Magnus asked, still campaigning in Denmark, my lord. His army is 2 weeks away at best, maybe more. We're alone. A profound silence fell over the square as the implications settled into every mind. Dragsvik could field perhaps 40 fighting men, fishermen and farmers with more courage than training. Against 200 longships filled with Danish berserkers, they stood no chance in conventional battle. We evacuate, Magnus declared. Take the children and what supplies we can carry into the mountains. Wait for the king's return. And abandon our homes, called out Gunnar Eriksson. Let them burn everything we've built. Better to rebuild than to die uselessly, Magnus replied. We have until tomorrow at dawn to prepare. Gather only what you can carry. Wait. Rurik's voice cut through the growing panic like a blade through cloth. There might be another way. All eyes turned to him, standing beside Skelmir in the center of the square. The horse seemed to sense the tension in the air, his ears pricked forward and his muscles coiled with readiness. The Danes don't know about Skelmir, Rurik continued, his mind racing through possibilities. They don't know about the bond we've formed, or what that bond might accomplish in battle. 1 man and 1 horse against 200 ships. Magnus shook his head. Even mounted. You couldn't. Not just me, Rurik interrupted. All of us, every fighting man in the village. He turned to address the crowd, his voice carrying the authority he had once commanded as a berserker leader. How many of you have ever seen a horse in battle? Real cavalry, not just mounted scouts? A few hands rose, old warriors who remembered the campaigns of their youth. Then you know what a single mounted warrior can do to infantry, Rurik continued. One horse and rider, properly used, can break a shield wall or scatter a band of raiders. Imagine what 40 mounted warriors could accomplish. Understanding began to dawn in several faces, but Bjorn voiced the obvious problem. We have one horse, Rurik. Skelmir won't carry anyone but you. Skelmir won't, Rurik agreed, but there are other horses in these mountains, wild herds that run free in the high pastures. Horses that might respond to the same methods we've used with Skelmir. The suggestion sent a murmur of hope and disbelief through the crowd. Wild horses were notoriously difficult to catch, let alone train for battle. The process typically took months or years. We have one day, Magnus pointed out. Less than that, actually, even if we could find these horses. We don't train them, Rurik said. We ask them. He reached into his pouch and withdrew the river stones that had become symbols of his bond with Skelmir. The connection we've built isn't based on dominance or breaking their will. It's based on mutual understanding, shared purpose. If we can communicate that purpose, if we can show them what's at stake, they might choose to help. Elder Astrid stepped forward, her ancient eyes bright with possibility. The old stories speak of such things, she said, times when the wild horses of Asgard came to aid mortal warriors in their greatest need. But the price doesn't matter, Rurik interrupted. Not if we can save our people. Through his connection with Skelmir, he felt the stallion's understanding and agreement. The horse had memories of battle, of the exhilaration and terror that came with cavalry charges. More importantly, he had the intelligence to grasp what they faced, and the nobility to choose sacrifice over safety. Where are these herds? Magnus asked, his practical mind already working through logistics. High meadows, 3 hours' ride to the north, replied old Eriksson, who had been a hunter in his youth. 20, maybe 30 head, mix of mares and young stallions. And you believe they'll simply agree to carry untrained riders into battle? Magnus's skepticism was evident. Rurik looked at Skelmir, feeling the horse's calm confidence flow through their bond. I believe they'll respond to honesty, to the knowledge that sometimes we must all choose between comfort and courage. The debate that followed was intense, but brief. Some argued for evacuation, others for making a stand behind the village walls. But as more details emerged about the Danish advance, their systematic destruction, their apparent determination to leave no survivors, it became clear that running would only delay the inevitable. If we're going to try this madness, Magnus said finally, we need to start now. Select your 40 best riders and gather what weapons we can spare. But understand if this fails, if the horses won't cooperate or can't be convinced, we evacuate immediately. As the villagers dispersed to prepare, Rurik found himself alone with Skelmir at the edge of the square. Through their bond, he could feel the horses' memories, stirring images of other battles, other desperate charges against overwhelming odds. You know what I'm asking of you, he said quietly, not just to fight, but to lead others into battle, to become what your first rider trained you to be. Skelmir lowered his head to nuzzle Rurik's shoulder, a gesture that had become their ritual of agreement and trust. But there was something else in the contact, a sharing of memory that made Rurik gasp with recognition. He saw Torvin Oathkeeper as he had been in life, young, idealistic, burning with the desire to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. He saw the man's death not as a failure, but as a choice to stand and fight when retreat was possible. And he saw, through Skelmir's eyes, the moment when Torvin had used his last breath to tell his horse to run not out of cowardice, but out of love. He wanted you to live, Rurik whispered, understanding flooding through him. That's why he drove you away. He knew that sometimes survival is the greatest act of courage. The revelation reframed everything that had happened between them. Their bond wasn't built on shared guilt, but on shared love. Love for a man who had understood that true honor sometimes required sacrifice. As they prepared to ride north toward the wild herds, Rurik felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. Not just for Skelmir, but for every soul in Dragsvik who would depend on the success of this desperate gamble. The charred wood fragment lay forgotten in the square, its message of destruction already delivered. Soon it would be joined by other fragments, pieces of their own lives and homes, scattered to the wind if their plan failed. But for now, there was hope. Fragile and desperate, built on the belief that understanding could triumph over force, that partnership could overcome conquest. "Come, my friend," Rurik said, swinging onto Skelmir's back. "Let's see if we can work one more miracle." As they rode toward the mountains, the bond between them pulsed with shared purpose and mutual trust. Behind them, 40 men prepared for the battle of their lives. Ahead lay wild horses who might choose to join their cause or flee from human contact entirely. Everything depended on whether the language of the heart could be spoken quickly enough to save them all. The high meadow stretched before them like a green sea, dotted with the moving forms of wild horses grazing in the afternoon sun. Rurik counted 23 animals, a mix of sturdy mountain ponies and sleek mares, led by a grey stallion whose scars spoke of battles fought for herd leadership. Behind him, 40 men of Dragsvik waited with the mixture of hope and skepticism that marked desperate ventures. They had followed him this far on faith and the memory of what they'd witnessed between him and Skelmir, but now the reality of their situation pressed down like a physical weight. "How do we approach them?" asked Magnus, his hand instinctively checking his sword hilt. "One wrong move, and they'll scatter to the four winds." Rurik dismounted, feeling the familiar weight of the river stones in his pouch. From his saddlebag, he withdrew the artifact that would either save them or seal their doom, a simple rope halter woven from Skelmir's own tail hair, created over the past 3 days as their bond had deepened. The halter represented everything they had learned about partnership rather than dominance. Unlike traditional rope gear meant to control, this was woven with intention and blessed with the trust that had grown between man and horse. If the wild horses could sense that difference, if they could understand the invitation rather than the threat, there might be hope. "We don't approach them," Rurik said, settling himself on the grass at the meadow's edge. "We wait for them to approach us." The men behind him shifted restlessly. Every warrior instinct screamed against such passivity when time was precious and enemies drew closer with each passing hour. But Rurik had learned patience from Skelmir, had discovered that sometimes the greatest strength lay in stillness. "Skelmir," he said quietly, "show them what we offer." The black stallion began to move through the grass, but not toward the wild herd. Instead, he danced the same flowing movements Rurik had seen in the meadow days ago, but now performed with conscious intention. Each step spoke of joy rather than captivity, of partnership rather than slavery. The effect on the wild horses was immediate. Heads lifted, ears pricked forward, and slowly the grey stallion began walking toward them. Behind him came the rest of the herd, drawn by curiosity, and something deeper recognition of a kindred spirit who had found something worth celebrating. "He's calling to them," whispered Bjorn, who had insisted on joining the expedition despite his youth. "Like he's telling a story." Through his bond with Skelmir, Rurik could sense the communication flowing between the horses, not words but emotions, images, the sharing of experience that transcended species. The wild stallion was learning about the bond, about the choice to trust, about the joy that could come from partnership freely given. When the grey horse finally reached them, he stopped just outside arm's length and studied Rurik with intelligent brown eyes. In that gaze, Rurik saw the same wariness he had encountered in Skelmir, the fear of betrayal born from too much experience with human cruelty. "I know what men have done to your kind," Rurik said softly, rising slowly to his feet. "I know the ropes and whips, the breaking of spirit and will, but this is different. This is a choice." He held out the tail-hair halter, letting the wild stallion investigate it with delicate nostrils. The horse could smell Skelmir's scent on the woven strands, could sense the trust and partnership that had gone into its creation. "Danish raiders come to kill our children," Rurik continued, his voice carrying across the meadow. "We ask not for your submission, but for your help. Fight beside us as equals, not as slaves." The grey stallion looked from the halter to Skelmir, then back to Rurik. For a heartbeat that felt like eternity, the fate of Dragsvik balanced on the decision of a wild horse who had never known human kindness. Then, slowly, deliberately, the stallion lowered his head. The gesture sent a shock of hope through the watching men. One by one, the other horses began to approach mares and young stallions, each making their own choice to trust in the promise of partnership. "Quickly now," Rurik called to his men, "but gently. Let them accept the halter, freely. No force, no coercion, they must choose to carry you." What followed was unlike anything in the long history of horse taming. Instead of men conquering beasts, it became a ritual of mutual agreement. Each horse permitted the halter only after sensing the rider's intention, after understanding through some deeper communication that this was partnership rather than domination. Not every pairing succeeded. 3 of the horses, sensing fear or aggression in their potential riders, simply walked away. But 17 others accepted the bond, standing calmly as untrained men climbed onto their backs for the first time. Magnus found himself astride a sturdy bay mare whose patience seemed infinite. Bjorn partnered with a young stallion whose energy matched his own eagerness. One by one, the impossible cavalry of Dragsvik took shape. "How long until they reach the village?" Rurik asked, settling the tail-hair halter around the grey stallion's neck. "If they maintained their pace, they'll be in sight of our walls by sunset," Magnus replied, his voice tight with controlled fear. "We have, perhaps 4 hours." Through his bond with Skelmir, Rurik felt the approach of something larger than simple battle, a confrontation between 2 visions of the world, one built on conquest and the other on understanding. The wild horses seemed to sense it too. As they formed ranks with their new partners, there was no prancing or nervousness. Instead, there was the calm focus of beings who understood the stakes and had chosen their side. "For Dragsvik," Rurik called, his voice carrying across the meadow. "For our children and our future." The response that rose from 40 throats was echoed by the neighing of their mounts, a sound of unity that seemed to shake the very mountains. The Danish raiders came with the setting sun, their dragon ships black against the crimson sky. 200 warriors poured onto the beach below Dragsvik like a tide of death, their shields glinting with the promise of slaughter. At their head rode a giant of a man on a massive warhorse, Thorund Blood Eagle, whose reputation for cruelty had spread across the northern seas. From the ridge above the village, Rurik watched the enemy deploy with the cold assessment of a veteran warrior. The Danes formed traditional battle lines, expecting to face farmers and fishermen cowering behind wooden walls. They had no scouts watching the high ground, no awareness that anything had changed since their last easy victory. "They don't know we're here," Magnus whispered, his bay mare standing rock-steady beneath him, despite having been wild just hours before. "We have complete surprise." Through his bond with Skelmir, Rurik could feel the black stallion's battle readiness, the controlled tension of a warhorse who remembered glory and pain in equal measure. But there was something else in that connection now, something that made his breath catch with wonder. Skelmir was no longer alone in his memories of battle. Through the network of understanding that connected the wild horses to their new partners, every mount on the ridge was sharing in that experience. The mares, who had never seen combat, now carried the knowledge of cavalry charges. The young stallions understood the rhythm of battle as if they had been trained for years. In Rurik's saddlebag rested the final artifact of their journey, a simple iron horseshoe, bent and twisted from the hoof of Torvin Oathkeeper's first mount. He had found it that morning in Skelmir's secret valley, buried beneath years of fallen leaves but still bearing the mark of the smith who had forged it. It was a reminder that some bonds transcended death, that love and loyalty could echo across time to guide the living. "The children?" Rurik asked. "Safe in the mountain caves with Elder Astrid and the other elders," Magnus replied. "If we fail, we won't fail," Rurik cut him off. "We can't." Below them, Thorund, Blood Eagle, had dismounted and was surveying the village with the satisfaction of a predator contemplating easy prey. His warriors spread out in practiced formations, preparing for the systematic destruction that had marked their advance up the coast. "Now," Rurik said quietly. 40 riders urged their mounts forward, cresting the ridge like a wave breaking against the shore. The sight that greeted the Danish raiders was beyond their comprehension, a cavalry charge, led by a black stallion, whose rider bore no banner, no mark of rank, only the quiet authority of a man who had found his purpose. Thorund's roar of surprise and rage echoed across the battlefield as he scrambled for his mount. His warriors, caught completely off guard, struggled to reform their lines to face this impossible threat, but by then it was too late. The charge struck the Danish flank like Thor's own hammer. Wild horses who had learned warfare in a single afternoon fought with the skill of veteran cavalry. Mounts, guided by the shared memories that flowed between them. Riders who had never fought from horseback moved with fluid grace, their partnership with their mounts transcending mere training to become something approaching magic. Rurik found himself face to face with Thorund Blood Eagle in the heart of the melee. The Danish leader's warhorse was magnificent, a trained destroyer bred for battle. But training built on domination could not match the bond forged through mutual trust. Skelmir danced around the heavier horse like water flowing around stone, his movements impossible to predict or counter. When Thorund swung his massive war axe, the black stallion simply wasn't there. When the Dane tried to charge, Skelmir slipped aside and struck like lightning. "Impossible," Thorund snarled, his face twisted with rage and disbelief. "No wild horse could. They're not wild anymore," Rurik replied, the iron horseshoe warm against his side. "They've chosen to be free." The distinction was everything. Thorund's mount fought because it had been trained to obey. Skelmir fought because he had chosen to protect those he loved. The difference showed in every movement, every decision, every moment of perfect coordination between horse and rider. Around them, the battle turned into a rout. The Danish raiders, masters of infantry combat, found themselves helpless against cavalry tactics they had never encountered. Horses and riders moved as single entities, striking and withdrawing before counterattacks could form. When Thorund fell, struck down by Rurik's blade as Skelmir pinned the warhorse with perfectly timed movements, the heart went out of the Danish attack. The surviving raiders fled to their ships, leaving behind their dream of easy conquest and carrying with them tales of the ghost cavalry that had appeared from nowhere to destroy them. As silence settled over the battlefield, Rurik dismounted and placed his hand on Skelmir's neck. Around them, 40 exhausted but victorious riders sat astride horses who had proven that partnership could triumph over force. "Is it over?" Magnus asked, his voice hoarse from shouting battle cries. "This battle is over," Rurik replied, looking toward the fleeing ships. "But something greater has begun." Through his connection with Skelmir, he could feel the change spreading not just through their small band, but through every horse that had witnessed what was possible when trust replaced fear. The age of the horse whisperers had returned to the world. 3 months had passed since the battle that saved Dragsvik, and the world had begun to change in ways both subtle and profound. Word of the victory had spread along the trading routes, carried by merchants and travelers who spoke in hushed tones of the village where wild horses had chosen to fight alongside men. Rurik stood in the sacred grove where it had all begun, watching Skelmir graze peacefully among the ancient runestones. The black stallion bore no scars from the battle. The partnership they had forged had protected them both, in ways that went beyond mere skill with weapons. Around his neck hung a new artifact, one that had emerged naturally from their deepened bond, a collar of braided grass and wildflowers that Skelmir renewed each morning, as if declaring his choice to remain. "The king's messenger arrived this morning," Bjorn said, approaching through the morning mist. The young man had grown in the months since the battle, his shoulders broader and his eyes holding the quiet confidence of one who had faced death and emerged victorious. "King Harold wishes to meet the man who turned wild horses into cavalry." Rurik smiled, but didn't turn from watching Skelmir. "And what did you tell him?" "That you would consider it after the spring planting is finished." Bjorn settled beside him on the same fallen log where they had shared so many conversations. "Magnus thinks you should go. The king could offer you lands, titles, a return to the warrior's life you once knew. And what do you think?" Bjorn was quiet for a long moment, watching as several of the formerly wild horses grazed nearby with their chosen partners. The bond that had been forged in desperation had only grown stronger with time, creating relationships that seemed to blur the line between man and beast. "I think Torvin Oathkeeper would tell you to follow your heart," the young man said finally. "And I think your heart is already here." The wisdom in those words made Rurik's throat tighten with emotion. Over the past months, Bjorn had become the son he had never had, while Skelmir had become something beyond friend or mount a partner whose bond transcended the merely physical to touch realms of spirit that had no names. "Elder Astrid has been teaching others," Bjorn continued, "the methods you learned from Sigrid's writings. 3 more villages have sent representatives asking to learn the horse-whispering arts. This was perhaps the most significant change of all. The victory at Dragsvik had proven that Sigrid's ancient wisdom was not just historical curiosity but practical knowledge that could save lives. The techniques that had once been the jealously guarded secret of a few were spreading, carried by those who understood that partnership offered something that dominance never could. "And the risks?" Rurik asked. "The dangers that Astrid warned about?" "Some have struggled with the deep bonding," Bjorn admitted. 2 men had to be separated from their horses when the connection became too intense. But Astrid's safeguards, the protective rituals, the bone whistles, they seem to work for most people. Rurik touched the whistle at his own belt, the carved bone warm from long contact with his body. He had learned to use it, not to break the bond with Skelmir, but to maintain the balance between human consciousness and horse awareness. It was a delicate dance, but one that grew more natural with practice. "There's something else," Bjorn said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Something Astrid asked me to tell you when the time was right." He reached into his pouch and withdrew an object that made Rurik's breath catch another braided cord, but this one was different. Instead of being woven from leather or horsehair, it appeared to be made from strands of silver and gold, twisted together with such skill that they seemed to flow like liquid metal. "Where did this come from?" "Astrid found it yesterday, lying among the runestones where you first met Skelmir. She says it appeared during the night, placed there by hands unknown." Bjorn's eyes held wonder and a touch of fear. "She believes it's a gift from the gods themselves, recognition of what you've accomplished." The cord pulsed with warmth as Rurik took it, and for a moment he could have sworn he felt other presences in the grove shadows of those who had walked this path before him, including a woman, whose love for horses had driven her to disappear rather than see their bond destroyed. "Sigrid," he whispered. Through his connection with Skelmir, he felt the stallion's acknowledgement. The horse had always known more than he revealed, had perhaps been guided here by forces beyond mortal understanding. The bond they shared was not just between man and beast, but part of a larger pattern that stretched back to the time of the gods. As the morning sun climbed higher, painting the grove with golden light, Rurik made his decision. King Harold could wait. The world of kingdoms and conquest held no appeal for a man who had found something more valuable than gold or glory. Here, in this sacred place where ancient stones told stories of heroes and gods, he had discovered that redemption was possible for even the most broken souls. Here he had learned that love could transcend species, that understanding could triumph over force, and that sometimes the greatest courage lay not in fighting, but in choosing to trust. Skelmir lifted his head and approached, the wildflower collar bright against his midnight coat. As he had every morning for months, the stallion lowered his great head to rest against Rurik's chest, not in submission, but in affection freely given. "We're home," Rurik said quietly, stroking the warm neck of the horse who had saved not just his life, but his soul. "Finally, we're home." In the distance, the sounds of village life continued, children playing, craftsmen working, the eternal rhythm of human existence. But here in the sacred grove, surrounded by ancient magic and newer mysteries, two unlikely partners stood together in the morning light. They had found each other across the gulf of pain and species, had forged a bond that would echo through the ages, and had proven that even the wildest hearts could choose to love when offered understanding instead of dominance. The horse that no one could tame had taught them all the deepest truth, that freedom was not the absence of connection, but the choice to connect with those who deserved our trust.